So our reading is an excerpt from this book, which was the common read, which several of us in this congregation engaged in, along with several people from the our parent church, First Parish Brewster. The Third Reconstruction by Reverend Dr. William J. Barber. And of course, this is describing his experience over many, many years of social justice work in North Carolina. In many ways, that long winter of 2012 to 13 was our darkest hour. As we prepared for our 7th Coalition People's Assembly in Raleigh that February, we knew the avalanche of corporately funded extremism, which had poured into North Carolina since 2008, was a reaction against the perceived threat of our coalition's power. From 16 organizations that had gathered 5,000 people in 2007, we had grown to a coalition of 145 organizations representing black, white, and brown, labor and civil rights organizations, doctors and the uninsured, business people and the unemployed, women and men, gay and straight, young and old, documented and undocumented. Standing together against one attack after another, our ranks had grown fourfold, bringing as many people to Raleigh each winter as Dr. King had brought to Selma when he put out a national call for solidarity after Bloody Sunday in 1965. Our indigenously led, state government-focused Moral Fusion Coalition had scared the hell out of the governing elite. We knew before we started that the same forces in North Carolina's history had orchestrated America's only coup d'etat in 1898. 7 years of experience had shown us that, although time had changed the elite's weapons, it had not moderated their extremism. But a century of reflection and 7 years of fusionist organizing had taught us some important lessons about who we were. When we gathered in Raleigh that winter, I talked to our 20,000 battle-weary foot soldiers about the importance of knowing who we are in times like these. The greatest threat to our coalition was not the power of our opposition. They could threaten us. They could hurt us. They might, in their blind hubris, even try to kill some of us. But they could not, in the end, deny us, because ours was a moral struggle. We knew we would win if we didn't give up. The only question was how long the fight would go on, which was why the greatest threat to our coalition was the temptation to forget what we had learned about our identity. A nonviolent struggle has two possible ends: winning the opposition as friends or giving up the battle. Though our coalition included the full spectrum of North Carolina's diversity, we had come to recognize a common vision for our future in the history of the South's anti-racist freedom movement. Our relationships with one another were not simply transactional, a means to achieve our various organizations' goals. They had become transformational, lifting each of us to a new understanding of our interconnectedness as human beings and living members of one family. None of us would be free until all of us were free. Thus the slave's anthem became a battle cry even for the daughters and sons of former slave owners. Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Reflections on the Third Reconstruction. On Friday evening, about 10 members of this congregation went over to First Parish Brewster, our parent church, for what had been billed as a common read. The Common Read program has been going on at the national level for several years, but this was the first time we participated in it. The idea is simple. Everybody reads the same book, and then you discuss it. You can go on the UUA website today and discover that about a dozen congregations checked in as having read and discussed this year's selection. I don't know whether any other discussions involve two congregations, as ours did, but it was a good idea. And under the skillful leadership of Reverend Tracy Johnson, we got our two groups together to talk about social justice. So the book was this one, The Third Reconstruction, by Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, the second. Dr. Barber is in many ways the spiritual heir of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, he was born 2 days after Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. Like Dr. King, he is a black minister in the South, following the ministerial footsteps of his father. In Barber's case, both father and son were ordained in the Christian church, or disciples of Christ. For Dr. Barber's father, his ministry was entirely outside the congregation. He never served a congregation. Dr. Barber did serve a congregation in Goldsboro, North Carolina, but most of his energies have gone into the community organizing work he has done statewide. First under the auspices of the North Carolina Human Rights Commission, and then as state president of the NAACP. Dr. Barber believes in coalition building. He sees the struggle for African American advancement as intimately connected to the advancement of the rights of workers, the control of women over their bodies, the humane treatment of immigrants, the easing of mass incarceration. In the book, he describes how he has worked to build coalitions of groups advocating these separate interests and weld them into a mass movement. For in 2010, the North Carolina state legislature was taken over by conservative extremists financed by big money. And they quickly turned the state, renowned for its progressive features, into a laboratory for regressive legislation authored by a national conservative think tank called ALEC, A-L-E-C, which stands for American Legislative Exchange Council. The most significant moves were in curtailing voting rights, particularly for minorities, and this resulted in the election in 2012 of a very conservative governor. These regressive changes were met by Reverend Barber with organizing. He had been organizing annual demonstrations outside the state capitol. In 2012, he started a practice of converging on the state capitol weekly, on Mondays when the legislature was in session. He called these Moral Mondays, and they included civil disobedience, as certain of the leaders, including Dr. Barber, would be arrested. By 2014, Moral Mondays had been going on for about 2 years in Raleigh, and activists in other states had adopted the practice. That year, Dr. Barber wanted to organize a bigger rally for justice, and the call went out nationwide to come to Raleigh on a Saturday in February of 2014. Many of my ministry colleagues said they were going, and I felt the pull. It was predicted to be historic, like Selma. I always felt a little abashed that I wasn't there for most of the crucial action of the civil rights movement. And it happened that I had just started my sabbatical and had just moved into the house I own in Lexington. I had no church responsibilities for months to come, and my wife was on the West Coast concertizing. So at 1 p.m. on Friday in Lexington, Massachusetts, I discerned that where I needed to be was out on the streets of Raleigh, North Carolina the next morning at 9. And so I hopped in my car and headed down I-95. I got a few hours sleep at motels on the way down and the way back. When I got there, it was a beautiful morning. The crowds were enormous, and sprinkled throughout the crowd were yellow t-shirts proclaiming that we were standing on the side of love. Those were the UUs. I heard Dr. Barber speak, as well as UUA President Peter Morales. You can see them on the front of the order of service. Saw a bunch of old friends and made a few new ones, and even played some music with a pickup band. Around noon, I left Raleigh for the long drive back to Boston, but I stopped at a Krispy Kreme donut shop to stock up on a dozen of those decadent sugary treats you can't get north of the Mason-Dixon line. By 11 Sunday morning, I was back in Lexington and attended services at Fallen Community Church. Woody Allen is alleged to have said that 80% of success in life is showing up. Based on that, a movement was started a few years ago called Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is abbreviated SURJ, S-U-R-J. When the issue is a justice one which particularly affects black people, it is very important that white people show up. I was just one face, one white face, among tens of thousands, but I was glad that I had gone to show up for a justice event. The issues on which we were marching were broad, for the legislature was in the grip of really repressive forces, and it was necessary to oppose them on a broad front. Now, Dr. Barber is a conservative, Orthodox Christian who takes his inspiration from Jesus and the Hebrew prophets, much as Dr. King did. What is fascinating when you read the book is how easily he weaves the Bible into the most modern context, how naturally he draws his inspiration from its words, particularly the Hebrew Bible prophets. Amos, let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Micah, what does the Lord require of thee but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Isaiah, the Spirit of God has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim the liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to comfort all who mourn, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning. These passages are the stock in trade of the freedom struggle. And though biblical literacy is not high among UUs, they are our passages too. They are all in our hymn books, either as readings or hymns. You will recognize them in the last hymn we sing this morning. Besides being grounded in the Bible, Barber is also a student of history and points out that in the immediate aftermath of slavery, blacks and whites worked together to enshrine basic human rights into a new state constitution for North Carolina. Borrowing language from the American Declaration of Independence, this constitution named certain inalienable rights, among which were the right to life, liberty, and the enjoyment of the fruits of their labors. This last one was put in to ensure that slavery was dead, but also to recognize that workers had the right to bargain for their wages. Barber calls the interracial coalition that put through this Constitution fusion politics, and he models his efforts in the present day after this 19th century example. This was the first Reconstruction. Slavery had been a moral scar on American society for 3 centuries or more, and with its formal end, there needed to be major structural changes to accommodate the newly freed slaves and to bring them into the paid workforce, as well as the political power structure. Former slaves were able to own land, and many were elected to public office in that period. As we know, the first Reconstruction came to an end in 1876, when there was a disputed presidential election, and in a stalemate, the Southern states made a deal that they would support Rutherford B. Hayes if he would withdraw federal troops from the South. With the withdrawal of troops and the resurgence of campaigns of intimidation by white groups such as the KKK, the political gains made by blacks soon evaporated, and Jim Crow laws were passed by white legislatures. It took 7 decades for the pendulum to swing back. Reverend Barber points to 2 events in the early 1950s as the start of the civil rights movement, which he calls the Second Reconstruction. The first was a unanimous decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education, declaring that racially segregated schools violated the equal protection guarantees of the 14th Amendment. The second was the murder in 1955 of Emmett Till, a black teenager from Chicago, who was lynched in Mississippi while on a visit to his grandmother. His mother made the decision to have the boy's body with its severely disfigured face photographed in an open casket, and published in all of the newspapers. Dr. Barber points out that the Montgomery bus boycott, which many people think of as the opening shot of the civil rights movement, did not just happen because Rosa Parks was too tired that day. She was the secretary of the local NAACP, and the action had been planned and rehearsed well before she took her action. She had received training in nonviolent resistance at the Highlander Center in Tennessee. That second Reconstruction brought about significant progress in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the acceptance of black people in many areas of life which had been off limits. But shortly after these landmarks were achieved, Dr. King was assassinated. Dr. Barber subtitles his book, How a Moral Movement is Overcoming the Politics of Division and Fear. The politics of division and fear reasserted itself after each of the two first Reconstructions. That politics argues to poor whites that blacks are their natural enemies, that they will compete for their jobs, take their welfare, steal their women. In the second Reconstruction, the locus of this argument shifted from the Democratic Party, where it had lived for a century, to the party which had been set up by Lincoln originally to oppose slavery and became part of Nixon's Southern strategy. Dr. Barber sees his efforts in North Carolina as a harbinger of a third Reconstruction. As we readers compared notes last night on Dr. Barber's book, we noticed that several of us had focused on the same thing. A quote from Gandhi about movements for social change. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Dr. Barber's fusion power coalition certainly hasn't won every fight, but they win enough, and they keep on keeping on, because they know that their effectiveness consists in having the opposition believe that they will not go away. Now, what does any of this have to do with us here on Cape Cod? ALEC, A-L-E-C, is not threatening to take over the Massachusetts legislature. The Commonwealth is a beacon of progressive values, and we are blessed to be represented in the state legislature and in Congress by people who are not afraid to speak truth to power. Yet what Barber calls the politics of division and fear does crop up among us. It is not confined to any one party or any one region. A few years ago, we had a local issue of merging the Chatham and Harwich school systems. The merger had made sense for years from a financial point of view, but the voters of Chatham rejected it twice, largely out of an unspoken and irrational fear of people of color. It was the leadership of strong progressive forces, including some in this congregation, that overcame that politics of division and fear and brought the two school systems together. Fear and division, my friends, are never far away, for they are woven into the fabric of each of our souls. In the struggles in the political arena, some people will always make appeals to fear and try to demonize their opponents. And yes, progressives do this as well as conservatives. In the last few weeks, as the country has been gripped by the political drama on the national stage, some of you have shared with me that you are uncomfortable at how political my preaching has become. I appreciate this feedback, for I feel, and I hope you feel, that this congregation should be a place of refuge from the strident tone of our public discourse. But I don't think that it is either possible or desirable to completely ignore what is going on the national stage. What I think I'm called to do, what we're all called to do, is to meet it with love. What I want for us is not to be apolitical, but to cultivate a politics of the heart. Quillen Shin, one of the greatest evangelists for universalism, wrote this in the year 1900. Every exertion you put forth to make this world better is so much done to make our doctrine true. Let me give you that again. Every exertion you put forth to make this world better is so much done to make our doctrine true. God works through instrumentalities. We are all to be agents. A universalist who is idle, doing nothing to make his doctrine true, is a counterfeit, unquote. And when Shin says our doctrine, he means the core of universalism, the proposition that God is love and that love is the most powerful force in the universe. But this doctrine is not self-executing. We make it true by what we do. We are God's hands. We are God's legs. We are God's eyes. We are God's voice. Or if theistic language makes you uncomfortable, translate. We are the hands, feet, eyes, and voice of love. If we are idle, God is idle. Love is idle. And that representation imposes a special responsibility. It doesn't just call for any kind of reaction, but for a very specific kind. If we respond to the politics of division and fear by sowing more division and fear, we are not witnessing to the truth of love. The standard to which I want to hold myself, and I invite each of you to help hold me to it, is to respond to fear with love, to respond to hate with love, to preach and practice love at every turn. I do not want to be a counterfeit universalist. But claiming for ourselves an absolute power is the essence of insufferable arrogance, unless we also remind ourselves constantly that we do not have a monopoly on truth or insight. We cannot claim God on our side without recognizing that if God is God, she is on all sides. I remember one controversy, I think equal marriage, a few years ago. Somebody said, "What side are you on?" And he said, "I want to be on the side that doesn't have any sides." So, in Longfellow's words, let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. What are we doing? Well, this meeting house is offering public forums for people to get solid information, which will allow them to make choices about public issues. And beyond our current efforts, there's one other specific direction I will lift up. You may have noticed that a new coalition has formed here on Cape Cod to try to relieve some of the fears of our immigrants under the new policies. The Cape Cod Coalition for Safe Communities has already succeeded in getting the town of Dennis to affirm certain practices on its police force, which they were already doing. I think it would be helpful to have that same effort in all the towns of the Cape. As Dr. King continues to be an inspiration, almost a half-century after his death, Dr. Barber can inspire us in the present tense. Let us hope and pray that this third Reconstruction can finish the unfinished work of the first two and bring about true justice between the races and among people of every condition, native and foreign-born, documented and undocumented, black, white, yellow, brown, gray, straight, poor, wealthy, Christian, Jew, Muslim, atheist, Buddhist, labor and capital, young and old. Let us roll up our sleeves and plunge into what needs doing in this neighborhood. Amen.